I always believed that the people who stayed the longest in our lives were the ones we understood the best. Looking back now, I realize that was the biggest mistake I had ever made. If someone had told me that the woman I called my best friend had entered my life for a reason that had nothing to do with friendship, I would have laughed. I would have defended her without hesitation. I would have said that she had always been there for me through difficult moments, birthdays, disappointments, and every ordinary day in between. Now I know that some people don't have to lie every single day. Sometimes they tell the truth often enough that you never notice the lies hidden between it. My name is Emily. And this is the story of how I accidentally uncovered a secret that had been buried long before I was born. Everything started with a phone call on an ordinary Tuesday evening. I had just finished cleaning the kitchen after work. My life wasn't exciting. I lived alone in the old house my grandmother had left me when she passed away 3 years earlier. The neighborhood was quiet, almost too quiet. Most evenings were spent reading, tending to the flowers in the backyard, or watching rain collect on the windows. I actually liked that kind of life. Peace had become something precious after losing both my parents within a few years of each other. My grandmother had become my entire family. And after she was gone, the house was all I had left of her. The phone rang while I was making tea. The caller ID showed a name I hadn't seen in nearly 8 months. Claire. My best friend. We had met in college almost 12 years earlier. We weren't the kind of friends who talked every single day. But every time life became difficult, we somehow found each other again. When I answered, I immediately noticed something different. She sounded exhausted. Not emotional. Not dramatic. Just tired. She explained that her apartment building had suffered severe water damage after a burst pipe flooded several floors. The repairs were expected to take weeks, maybe even months. She had already spent money on temporary hotels, and every option seemed more expensive than the last. Before she even finished explaining, I told her she could stay with me. I didn't think twice. That's what friends do. She thanked me over and over again. I remember smiling after we ended the call. Helping someone I trusted felt natural. The next afternoon she arrived with 2 large suitcases, several storage boxes, and a tired smile that almost made me feel guilty for how comfortable my own life had been. We had for a long time. The house suddenly felt less empty. For the first few days, everything was exactly as I expected. We cooked dinner together, watched old movies, laughed about ridiculous memories from college. It almost felt like time had reversed itself. The silence that usually filled the house disappeared, replaced by conversations that lasted late into the evening. I realized how lonely I had actually been. Having another person around felt comforting. If anyone had asked me during that first week whether I trusted Claire, my answer would have been simple: completely. Looking back now, I often think about how strange it is that the warning signs never arrive all at once. They appear quietly, almost politely, small enough to ignore. The first thing I noticed was completely harmless. Claire became unusually interested in the history of the house. At first I assumed she was simply curious. The house was over 100 years old, built long before either of us had been born. It still had original wooden staircases, old stained glass windows, antique locks, and shelves my grandfather had built by hand. Visitors often admired it. Claire asked questions every day. Who built it? How long had my family owned it? Had anyone famous ever lived there? Were there hidden rooms? Did my grandmother ever mention secrets? I laughed every time. The questions sounded like someone trying to write a mystery novel. I answered everything I knew. The truth wasn't very exciting. The house had simply belonged to my family for generations. That was all. At least, that was what I believed. A few days later I came home from work and found several old family photo albums spread across the dining room table. Claire quickly apologized. She explained that she had become bored while I was away and wanted to learn more about my family. Again, nothing seemed strange. I even sat beside her as we flipped through the photographs together. Pictures of birthdays, Christmas mornings. Summer picnics, black and white portraits of relatives whose names I barely remembered. Claire looked at every single photograph much longer than I did. Sometimes she would quietly ask who someone was. Sometimes she didn't ask anything at all. Instead, she simply stared. One photograph held her attention longer than any other. It showed my grandmother standing beside an old stone building somewhere deep in the woods. I had never paid much attention to it before. Claire immediately asked where the picture had been taken. I admitted I had absolutely no idea. She nodded slowly, almost thoughtfully. Then she changed the subject. At the time, I didn't think anything about it. Weeks passed peacefully. At least on the surface. Then little things began disappearing. Not valuable things. Nothing anyone would report stolen. A flashlight. An old notebook. A measuring tape. Several keys that I rarely used. Eventually, each item would reappear somewhere completely different. I blamed myself. Living alone for years had probably made me forget where I placed things. Claire laughed every time I mentioned it. She joked that the old house was haunted. I laughed too. Now I wish I had in single quotes t. One Saturday morning I decided to clean the attic. Boxes covered in dust filled every corner. Most contained clothes that no longer fit anyone. Others held old books, holiday decorations, broken lamps, forgotten toys. Claire insisted on helping. While I sorted boxes, she wandered around studying every wall, every shelf, every corner of the attic. She wasn't searching through belongings. She seemed to be studying the house itself. At one point I noticed her examining the floorboards near the chimney. She quickly smiled when she realized I was watching. She said she thought one section looked newer than the others. I shrugged. The house had been repaired countless times over the decades. Nothing about that seemed unusual. Still, for reasons I couldn't explain, that image stayed in my mind. Later that evening, while making dinner, I remembered something my grandmother used to say. She always insisted that certain parts of the house should never be remodeled. Whenever contractors suggested renovations, she refused. She claimed the house should remain exactly as it had always been. When I was younger, I assumed she simply disliked change. Now, for the first time, I wondered if there had been another reason. I dismissed the thought almost immediately. It sounded ridiculous. Grandmothers say strange things all the time. Life returned to normal again. Or so I believed. Until one rainy Thursday. That afternoon my office closed early because of a power outage. I decided not to call Claire. I thought surprising her with coffee and pastries would be a nice gesture. The streets were almost empty as I drove home through the rain. When I parked outside, I noticed something unusual immediately. The front door wasn't fully closed. It rested slightly open. Just enough for the wind to move it back and forth. My heart skipped once. Claire was usually careful, very careful. I quietly stepped inside. The entire house was silent. No television. No music. No footsteps. I placed the coffee on the kitchen counter and called her name. No answer. I searched the living room. Nothing. Her bedroom door stood open. The room was empty. Then I heard it, a faint sound beneath my feet, not loud. Just a soft scraping noise, coming from somewhere below the house. I froze. There was only one place underneath the house, the basement, a basement that had remained locked ever since my grandmother died, and somehow. For the very first time in years, I noticed that the old brass key hanging beside the pantry was gone. I stood perfectly still, listening to the sound echo through the quiet house. At first, I tried to convince myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Old houses make strange noises. Wooden beams shift, pipes creak, rainwater can make sounds that seem almost human. But this was different. The noise stopped the moment I took another step. Someone had been moving. Someone knew I was home. I slowly walked toward the pantry where my grandmother had always kept a small collection of keys, hanging on brass hooks. Most of them belonged to old cabinets or storage sheds that no longer existed. One hook was empty. The basement key had always hung there. I had never touched it after my grandmother passed away. I remembered trying to ask my aunt why the basement stayed locked. She had smiled awkwardly and simply said that my grandmother wanted it that way. There had been no further explanation. Eventually, I stopped wondering. Until now. I looked toward the narrow hallway leading to the basement door. The farther I walked, the colder the air became. The light above the staircase flickered once before staying on. My heart was pounding so loudly that I could barely hear anything else. Then I saw it. The heavy wooden basement door wasn't closed. It stood slightly open. Only a few inches. Darkness filled the space beyond it. For a long moment, I couldn't move. I wasn't afraid of the basement itself. I was afraid of finding someone inside. I reached for the door and pushed it open slowly. The old hinges groaned loudly. The scraping sound had completely disappeared. The staircase descended into darkness. I searched the wall until I found the switch. The yellow light blinked several times before finally illuminating the room below. Nothing. At least, that's what I thought. The basement looked exactly the way abandoned places usually look. Dust covered everything. Old shelves leaned against the walls. Wooden crates were stacked in neat rows. There were rusted gardening tools, empty glass jars, broken furniture, and boxes that looked as though they hadn't been opened in decades. It smelled like old wood and damp stone. No person. No movement. I let out a nervous laugh. Maybe I really had imagined everything. I took one careful step downstairs. Then another. Every step stirred years of dust into the air. It quickly became obvious that the basement had not been completely abandoned. Someone had walked here recently. Fresh footprints cut through the dust on the concrete floor. They led deeper into the basement. I knelt beside them. The footprints weren't mine. Someone wearing sneakers had crossed the room only minutes earlier. Without thinking, I followed them. The trail stopped near the back wall. At first glance there was nothing unusual. Just old shelves filled with boxes. Then I noticed one shelf had been moved. Only slightly. Enough to expose part of the stone wall behind it. My pulse quickened. I carefully pushed the shelf aside. Hidden behind it was a small wooden door no taller than my shoulders. I stared at it in disbelief. I had lived in this house for 3 years. I had never seen it. The tiny door wasn't locked. Someone had already opened it. Inside was a narrow storage room. Unlike the basement itself, almost no dust covered the floor. Someone had been inside recently. Very recently. The room contained only 3 things. An old wooden desk, a metal lockbox, and several stacks of faded papers tied together with blue ribbon. The lockbox immediately caught my attention. It looked expensive despite its age. There was no key. Before I could inspect it further, I heard footsteps above me. I froze. Someone had entered the house. The footsteps moved across the kitchen, then stopped. I quickly switched off the basement light. The darkness swallowed me. I barely dared to breathe. A few seconds later I heard Claire's voice calling my name from upstairs. She sounded completely calm, as if nothing unusual had happened. I remained silent. The footsteps continued through the house. Closets opened. Doors closed. It almost sounded like she was searching for something. Then everything became quiet again. Several long minutes passed before I finally climbed back upstairs. Claire was standing in the kitchen, unpacking groceries. She smiled warmly when she saw me. Her expression looked perfectly natural. She apologized for leaving the front door open. She claimed the wind must have pushed it after she carried the groceries inside. I almost believed her. Almost. Then I noticed something. The grocery bags contained only a few items. Milk. Bread. Fruit. Nothing heavy. There was no reason she would have needed to leave the front door wide open. And there was another detail. Her shoes. The soles were covered with gray basement dust, the same dust that now covered my own shoes. She noticed me looking, without saying anything. She casually stepped backward until her feet disappeared beneath the kitchen table. I smiled, pretended everything was normal. I said nothing about the basement. Nothing about the hidden room. Nothing about the footprints. That evening, after Claire went to bed, I couldn't sleep. Questions kept circling through my mind. Why had my grandmother locked the basement? Why had Claire secretly gone down there? How had she even found the key? And what exactly had she been looking for? Round midnight I quietly returned downstairs carrying a flashlight. This time I photographed everything. The footprints, the hidden room. The papers, the OOCKBOX. One stack of documents immediately caught my attention. The top page contained my grandmother's handwriting. I recognized it instantly. The paper was dated 37 years earlier. The first sentence made my stomach tighten. If anyone outside our family is reading this, then everything has already gone wrong. I carefully untied the blue ribbon holding the pages together. The handwriting became increasingly hurried from one page to the next. My grandmother described someone she refused to identify by name. She referred to that person only as the collector, according to the journal. The collector believed my family possessed something incredibly valuable. Not jewelry. Not money. Not property. Something much older. Something that had supposedly been hidden generations earlier. The strangest part was that my grandmother admitted she didn't even know whether the story was true. She only knew that strangers had searched for it more than once. She warned every future member of our family never to trust anyone who showed unusual interest in the house, the family history, or the basement. I felt a chill run through my entire body. Every question Claire had asked over the past few weeks suddenly replayed inside my mind. The photographs. The attic. The walls. The basement. The old stories. None of it had been random. For the first time since she moved into my home, I began to wonder if our friendship had ever been as genuine as I believed. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Claire studying my grandmother's photographs, examining the walls, asking endless questions that had once sounded harmless. Now every memory carried a different meaning. By morning, I had made one decision. I wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. If Claire had a reason for being in my basement, I wanted to know the entire truth before she realized I suspected anything. So I behaved exactly as I always had. I made breakfast. We drank coffee together. I smiled when she smiled. I even apologized for being unusually quiet, blaming a stressful week at work. She seemed relieved. Whatever she expected from me, suspicion clearly wasn't part of her plan. Over the next several days, I became the observer instead of the trusting friend. Whenever I returned home, I paid attention to the smallest details. The position of chairs, the angle of picture frames, the dust on the windowsills. The placement of books on the shelves. It didn't take long before I noticed a pattern. Claire never searched the same room twice. Every day she focused on a different part of the house. One afternoon it was the attic. The next day she spent nearly an hour inside the laundry room. Another evening I found her standing alone in the hallway, staring at the old grandfather clock my grandparents had owned for decades. When she noticed me, she smiled naturally and claimed she simply admired antique furniture. I smiled back. Inside, my doubts continued to grow. Then something happened that changed everything. It was Saturday. Claire announced that she was meeting an old coworker for lunch and would probably be gone until evening. As soon as her car disappeared down the street, I locked the front door and hurried into the basement. This time I wasn't interested in the journal. I wanted to inspect every inch of the hidden room. The wooden desk contained nothing except dried ink bottles and several blank notebooks. The shelves were empty. Only the metal lockbox remained unopened. I examined it carefully. There was no visible keyhole. Instead, I noticed a loose wooden board beneath the desk. When I lifted it, something wrapped in faded cloth slid onto the floor. It wasn't treasure. It wasn't money. It was another key. Unlike the basement key, this one was small, silver, and beautifully engraved with tiny vines. I immediately tried it on the lockbox. The lock clicked open. Inside rested a single leather folder. No gold. No jewels. No mysterious map. Just documents. At first I felt disappointed. Then I opened the folder. The first page contained an old birth certificate. The second was a property deed. The third was a handwritten family tree stretching back more than 100 years. I frowned. None of it explained why anyone would secretly search my house, until I reached the final envelope. Inside were several letters my grandmother had written but apparently never mailed. One sentence immediately caught my attention. The object everyone keeps searching for never existed. It was a story invented decades ago to protect something far more valuable. I turned the page quickly. The next sentence answered the question I hadn't even realized I was asking. The real inheritance is the land itself. Hidden beneath it are the mineral rights that were never transferred after the original survey. If the truth becomes public before the paperwork is complete, people will stop at nothing to obtain ownership. I stared at the words. Mineral rights, not buried treasure, not a priceless artifact. The land beneath my house was worth far more than the house itself. Suddenly everything made sense. If someone could prove ownership before the legal records were corrected, they could become incredibly wealthy. A loud sound upstairs interrupted my thoughts. A car door slammed outside. Claire. She was home hours earlier than expected. I barely had time to return everything before hearing the front door open. Her footsteps moved quickly across the kitchen. Unlike every other day, she wasn't pretending to relax. She was walking with purpose. Straight toward the basement. I quietly stepped behind the old shelves, hidden in the shadows of the secret room. The basement door opened. Seconds later, I heard her walking down the stairs. She wasn't hesitating. She knew exactly where she was going. She moved the shelf aside without searching for it. Then she entered the hidden room. For a moment she simply stood there. Then I watched her open the empty lockbox. She froze. Her breathing changed instantly. She knew someone had already been there. Very slowly she looked around the room. Her eyes stopped on the desk. Then on the floor. Then on the shelf. She wasn't looking for treasure anymore. She was looking for the person who had found it first. I remained perfectly still, not even daring to breathe. After several tense minutes, Claire quietly closed the lockbox. She whispered something so softly I couldn't understand it, then she left. Only after I heard her car disappear once again did I finally come out of hiding. Standing alone in that hidden room, I realized one thing with absolute certainty. Claire hadn't come into my life because she needed a place to stay. She had come because she believed my grandmother had left behind something worth stealing. And now, she knew she wasn't the only one searching for it.